Thank you, Mr. Srinivas. Friends, see, I found many of the chores associated with the book are far more difficult than actually writing the book. One of it is reading the proof of the book. The other thing is that you have to talk about the book, say what my book is about. And I find that Mr. Srinivas has done such a splendid job. And whenever she listens to these things, my wife says, no, but they are able to say better than you and in a much shorter time than what the book is about. So I'm thankful. All of them are veterans here, and I'm almost intimidated by Mr. Shyam sir and then Jaydev and Mr. Srinivas. All of them are, titans in the field of China studies, and what they have written, what they speak, have influenced me for so many years. And there is Mr. Premshankar Jha. There are so many people here who are so well versed in China, and I'm actually overwhelmed that they have paid attention to my book and they have engaged with it and they speak about it. And in fact, I have been speaking to many of these people even before writing this book. And a lot of people in the course of my travels to China, when I worked there, when I came back, I've been motivated by their responses to my writings and to my work as to this thing. And one question which people kept asking me is, but why did you write a book on China? You've been to so many places, you've written on so many other subjects, but why on China? I've written first one also on Nepal. It was more a kind of this thing. Now, I've been thinking hard where exactly the trigger lay, because it's not sufficiently convincing even to myself to say, okay, Prem told me you should write a book, Shastri, or people like Vijay, we've traveled together and so on. I've been thinking long and hard about this, from where the first impulses came. And it's only in the last few days after one of my friends, he insisted that I find this, from where the trigger came. That actually all of us in the 70s and so on, we were the people who kind of followed every development in China. We read Max Weber, we read everything about Mao, and even 80s and so on, we sat with Giri Deshinkar, Veera Sinha Bhattacharya, all these people, and we learned from them about Joseph Needham and Charles Bettelheim and all these people. And then later somehow in the course of one's work, and for all of us, our ambition was to go to Castro's Cuba, Ho Chi Minh's Vietnam, Mao Zedong's China, Mandela's South Africa. But somehow life doesn't follow the course that you aspire to. And like many other journalists, I ended up going to Europe more often, the developed world, US and other countries, the Soviet Union. And it was much later, I had almost given up that I would get to go to China. But then again in the 80s and 90s, my interest was revived in China, and I started reading a lot of the books that were written and so on. And it came to me as a big surprise when I was invited to go with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh when he was going. And actually, since I was not a correspondent in the sense, I was more of an editorial writer, although I've done a lot of reporting and did it even as an editorial writer, I was really surprised because only once before Mr. Jaswant Singh had asked me whether I would like to be part of his delegation. So I had declined because I didn't see what I would do when I went to their Asia Pacific conference. But in this case, I was assigned by the Tribune to go with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and it really kind of blew my mind what I saw China. There was not a minute silence in Beijing when I went in January 2008. They were building Beijing as if everything had to be completed tomorrow morning for the Olympics in August. And this was very far from the films and books and things when I read about China, all those photographs one had seen of people in grey and black and going on bicycles in it. There were cars, and there was such an explosion of kind of lights and colors and an aspirational China which was just kind of erupting, one would say, a million kind of hopes and aspirations bursting forth. So I really felt maybe I should find an opportunity to come and work here. But it was just a thought, and for some strange reason, I have this habit of wherever I go, I carry back the newspapers with me, and I carried back copies of China Daily and things like that and brought it home. It was just a couple of some 4 or 5 months later, somebody from China Delhi came and he said, no, would you like to come and work for us? So I said, why? Then I said, but he said, can you come and meet me in Delhi? I said, I can't, I just come back. So he said, no, I can come to Chandigarh and meet you. So he came and he said, but why have you got copies of China Daily here? So I said, no, I was there, I brought it. My wife said, no, it can't be chance. You went there 6 months ago, the paper is there and this guy comes. So I said, no, it's just one of those things that happened. So, and in between this, what had happened in the 90s was, I tried once to go to China, but I think I got cold feet. My wife, who's an artist, she was selected for a fellowship by the Ministry of Culture. So it was 2 years, our daughter was very young, she was only 3 years. So I spoke to friends who worked in Hong Kong. They said, oh, China is no problem, you go there, you join this Westerners ghetto, you work with AP or something, she'll do her work, we'll have enough money, it's not a big deal. So I said, but why do I want to go and live in a Westerners ghetto? If I live in China, I want to be able to go around everywhere. I hadn't lost my hearing then and I was more keen on going at that time. So anyway, we thought about it and then I had a friend in Reuters who was there, who traveled and so on. He said, no, you should go. But somehow we decided against it. Again, a year or two later, surprisingly, we never expected it, she again got a call from the ministry asking her if she would like to go. So again she declined. So I said, no, that's the end of any plans to go to China. And we were not very keen, I was not very keen on going to a Dengist China. You know, Mao China was very different. It was like, you know, Castro's Cuba for us. So, but finally then when I saw this, then I said, no, this is a very different China. And I was suddenly gripped by an urge to this thing. And then I also realized what I was reading about China. What I read in the books, the analysis, the criticism, the insights, they made a lot of sense. But a lot of what I read by way of information, I found that it did not convey the picture of China that I was actually seeing unfold before my eyes when I was living there, when I was walking around, when I traveled to the various provinces. And the journalists, then there was a whole new generation of journalists who were writing books, people like Peter Hessler, I've read most of his books and so on. And it was really astonishing, eye-opening. And every time I came back, I talked to people, they said, but we don't know these things. So it was this kind of thing that finally, after much kind of, you know, it was kind of tormented thoughts of should I write, should I not write. And then I got together all that I had written. So I want to correct that impression, that because some people have got that impression, especially Ambassador Krishnan Srinivasan, who has reviewed my book in the Statesman last week. So he has made his, towards the end he makes two important points. One is that there are no dates before and after each of the articles in the book. So first and foremost I want to say, while it is a compilation based on my writings, these are not reproductions of my articles as they were. It is the body of material from which I have written a book and which I think meets the test of not being just a number of articles stitched together. I have used those articles. For instance, if you mentioned my reports on the NSB, it was not one single report. There were several reports over a certain period. I've taken it together, the dates have been woven into it. The second thing is, the first thing I attempted was redefining how China is reported, written about, trying to redefine how these stories are told or retelling some of the stories that have been off-told or not told at all. So to find an appropriate language for it. Because at one level, many things I found struck me very hard. So I wanted to sit back, think it over, let it cool down, let the impression come down, then take again a cold look at it and then write about it. And then there were other things like there's a lot of social sickness, there's a lot of unrest there, you know, not all of them visible. There are huge black holes in China. So again, so all of it is true, what one reads in the Western media. But although it is a very small part of the large picture, it still affects a much larger population than, let us say, any of the European countries. And there are very interesting things. For instance, I found almost all the Europeans who, when they interviewed the Chinese leaders, they would ask, but isn't there too much government in China? So I said, this is a strange question. In Europe, there are 30 countries for a population of how much? And for the whole of China, how many governments are there? For India or China, there might be bureaucratism and so on. But in terms of government, there are large spaces where it is almost impossible for a government in India or China to exercise total control, no matter what technology is there at their disposal. So neither the government, nor the party, nor the media is a monolith there. So first and foremost was to get out of this perception of it being a monolith. The second thing was, I thought to say this in a number of my writings, yeah. And then the second thing Ambassador Krish Srinivasan has mentioned in his book is, he says that the style where the way things end and they are composed, somehow he was very uncomfortable with it. He felt he did not find it coherent. This is something I would like to ask Ambassador Shyam sir and these people to kind. I also want to ask some questions today. So usually I want the questions, I want them, because the style I have adopted is what is known as cutting edge linear narrative. I might not be the best person to have practiced it, that's a different thing. And I have adopted this style from this book called 1,000 Plateaus, which is by the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze and the psychoanalyst Felix Guattari. They have written more about schizophrenia and so on. So this is where you can begin reading anywhere and stop reading anywhere without losing the plot, because there is no one central plot that is required to hold the narrative. It's like a music album, you play whichever record you want to. Perhaps the date and paper named by accompanying each article would have been a good idea. But the book is not a reproduction of articles, and I did not want it to be seen as such. So even without the dates, I think if it is seen like that, maybe the word compilation has given it the wrong kind of impression. So this is what I want to say, and I'm not going to speak much about the Chinese media. I should respond to any questions because I have written about it at greater length in the book. And many people have found it to be the most interesting thing. So almost in all the book discussions that I have had here and elsewhere, that is the subject which is most discussed. And I will leave that for another occasion. And I have any time more. I think I've taken my time, and I leave it to people who know China better, kind of.
I'll invite Sri Jaydev Ranudeji for his comments, please. Yes.
Thank you. At the outset, let me just say that Shastri, written by a person who's been sitting at the heart of one of the key organizations, central organizations in China, which is the propaganda department. I don't know how much of their atmosphere has seeped into you, but the book is, I must say, quite objective. It's very objective, despite you having been there. Considering that the propaganda department is the one that manufactures narratives, I half expected to see everything put across in a very positive light, but that was not so. And as you said, these are bits and pieces of your writing which you put together. I think it makes for a very quick and satisfying read, the book. I mean, it may not go very much into depth in certain things, but it does. And I'll echo, I think, what Shyam had said to you. I wish you had dwelt a bit more on the propaganda department and how it is, how the functioning is from within. But anyway, that's another matter. Fairly early on in the book, you've also touched on certain things that I think many educated Indians also ask. Do we have enough resources? Why can't we become a developed nation? Why is it taking us so much time, etc.? And how has China done it? I mean, this is a question that you keep hearing from all kinds of people. And are the resources adequate or not? And you also seem to have been struck by that, the speed of development, the scale of development, etc. And how all this happened actually after the constraints were removed, constraints of governance were removed. But having said that, this reminds me of a particular incident that happened. You alluded to it just now, but many years ago, I was attending a seminar in Harvard on economics and development, etc. And a point was made by the professor. He was comparing India and China. And in the course of that, he was very critical of India. A Chinese student sort of raised his hand and said, I have a comment to make. And he, in fact, took on the professor. He said, you are saying all this, but I am a Chinese, I've just come away from China. And let me tell you that things are not all that rosy. Because when the government decides to do something, they don't listen to us. And he gave an example of how when there was famine in a particular place, there was no attention paid. Because he said there were no voices raised. People just couldn't raise their voice. They couldn't shout it out. And he compared it with us and said, that's a very positive thing in India. So that's just the point that I'm trying to make. The second, of course, is about the luxury shopping, as you put it. All the premier brands of the world are represented in China. I think I would also add that the Chinese are very proud of the fact that all these companies are there, the Prada, Louis Vuitton, etc. And they are far more conscious of it than, I would say, in today's context, than the Russians are. And therefore, it would hurt them much more if these companies start withdrawing. And I think that's a factor that is always there below the surface, nowadays at least, as far as the party is concerned. But what you said about the structure of the China Daily and all, as I said earlier, was very interesting. Xinhua also. Xinhua, of course, has the advantage of being the voice of the government and voice of the party. And what they say is the final word.
This is a state by itself.
It's a state by itself. You made that point, actually. Another thing that I found interesting was your argument as to why there was no Jasmine Revolution in China. And of course, that is, many points can be advanced as to why it didn't take place. But you made the argument that it is because the Chinese Communist Party grew out of a homegrown revolution, and it was the people's own, party. But I think added to that are the very stringent and increasingly stringent measures that are being put in place, which today somehow have come almost akin to Mao's policy, where he was trying to control the thought. And I think Xi Jinping is trying that. It will take him time. But he started putting party cadres in primary schools, classes, etc. He started the process. It's going to take time. But I think the extent of security in China is something that could be brought out. And it's one of the things that we have. In passing, I'll just mention there was a reference to the one-child policy and how it hasn't, how they've relaxed it. But despite the relaxation, it's made no change. People are still not getting married, the youngsters. And I spoke to a few of them just before COVID, which was my last visit. And some of the girls said, but why should we get married and share our salary with the husband? We'd rather share it with our parents, and he can do his own thing. So I asked them, how do you live then? So they know we're happy as we are. He lives with his parents, I live with mine. We don't get married, that's about the only thing. I'll conclude in the end. I'll just come to the India-China factor. I think events have, if I may say, sort of overtaken the book, the manner in which you are writing. But I would like to say that it's not, there is a tendency to feel that we made a mistake somewhere in our policy. I don't know whether that is entirely correct. I think I've always believed that it takes two to tango, and the other side also has to put a foot forward. And one goes into history, one finds a lot of either missteps or misunderstandings at a point of time. But I'll just point out two. One was at the time of Li Keqiang's visit here, his first visit to India as Premier of China. That was in 2013, April. As you know, at that time it was that kind of intrusion that happened, the quality and quantity of it, got the attention of people here. And there were a lot of inquiries as to why it happened, what was the reason. And later on it came to light, in fact, the Chinese defense attaché here at that time, he confided to someone that it was planned by the PLA, it was approved by the Politburo, who also discussed whether India would cancel or scrap Li Keqiang's visit to India because of that. And their conclusion was that India would not, for fear of annoying China. Now I found that, well, in a way, their reading of us, but it also showed that this was a planned intrusion in 2013. Of course, you know that shortly after that there was a very long article justifying China's claim on Ladakh, etc. The second was, I think, during Xi Jinping's visit here in 2014, following year. I mean, both have happened after Xi Jinping took over. Xi Jinping is coming here. The intrusion started before he arrived. It continued through his stay here and continued for, I think, over a month after he went back. And various efforts were made. And I believe, I understand that when finally contact was established with the Central Military Commission in Beijing, they said, you should have told us earlier, we'd have resolved it. That is sort of treating us with scant, it's almost insulting us intellectually, I would say. That we know that the Chinese have at least 6 to 8 agencies sitting here and reporting back to Beijing, and yet the Central Military Commission makes that kind of comment. So my point is that, these things were planned actions, planned there, not necessarily here. And the final point I'd like to make is that in 2016, Xi Jinping had, from what I know from very reliable sources, had decided to teach India a lesson. Maybe it was a culmination of all the things that you said, energy, this, that and the other, but he decided to teach India a lesson. It was discussed in the Politburo and they agreed to defer it. I think one of the reasons for Doklam was because there was some kind of energization of the PLA which had started happening, but I don't know. But what we do know, or what we did see, is that while scrutinizing the military literature coming out of China, at that from 2016 onwards, it was very clear that the Chinese were building up to something. The kind of exercises taking place in Tibet, the number of forces moved into Tibet, the kind of comments being made about India in general terms was quite, it was quite disconcerting. And I will mention one particular remark which caught my attention. It was a small article in one of the papers which said that we should deploy, we mean the Chinese should deploy J-10 aircraft in Nari, which is Ali MSD, military sub-district, for use by the Pakistanis when conflict breaks out. That was I still remember the phrase. That was the kind of thing that was going on. Obviously not friendly gestures, but it was happening. So when, and I think it had become fairly safe to anticipate at that time that, a showdown was likely. So when it happened in 2020, I think it should not have come as a surprise. I don't think it did. But there's a couple of points that I thought I'd like to make. You have also spoken about things that needed to have been done. You spoke about Tibet and other things. I would link them to some extent. Of course, Tibet is another issue. But the way that they had planned the occupation of Tibet, even before they had actually completed the, shall I say, occupation of Beijing or the liberation of Beijing, Mao's concepts were very clear. So that was a friction point, a possible friction point that was coming up, unless we wanted to resolve it in some manner. But I thought, I would just flag this, that lest one comes away with the feeling that it was only, from here that we weren't including the signals. But I would say that, to sum it up, that in all, I found the book worth reading, and certainly worth reading, worth keeping, I'd say. And I wish that you do delve a bit more into the propaganda department and any other central organization that you can, because what we lack here is a first-hand account of the inner functionings of the Chinese Communist Party. We pick it up, of course, from newspapers, from other articles, etc. But from a person who's been right there, it would make a lot of difference. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I think that was quite erudite and extremely eloquent. I'll invite Sri Ravi Bhuthlingam ji for.
Good evening, everyone. And first of all, congratulations, Shastri, on this very fine book. It is not a surprise that we have all absolutely packed to full capacity here. When I read the book, I found it very gripping, very interesting, and easy read. The way you have structured it makes for a very fast pace. But that fast pace does not mean that you have omitted detail where detail is required. That's very important, and it is not easy to get the right mix between holding interest, keeping the narrative going, and also putting in the detail. Because as a journalist, you have to back up what you say with an array of facts and connect the dots, as it were. I think several of the comments from others in the book have remarked on the optimism that you have shown. And optimism is a somewhat rare quality these days when you talk of Sino-Indian relations. But I would like to say that the optimism that you have displayed is based on certain readings, which again you support with a certain number of facts. I give you a couple of illustrations of what I mean by this, but there is a can-do spirit that seems to come through the book, which is again, I think, quite unusual. What also particularly attracted me to this book was the title, Beyond Binaries. You explain in the book that the media, both in India and China, have tended to see each other as binaries. Like an American cowboy movie, there are the good guys and then there are the bad guys. As far as Indian media is concerned, China is the bad guy and vice versa. You, of course, you say in the book, interestingly, that in your assessment, Chinese media is a little less extreme than the Indian media. And my thought there was not that the Indian media is more moral or sort of imbued with greater qualities whatsoever, but because perhaps the Chinese reserve their harshest fire for the Americans. So we draw what you might call the secondary artillery in our direction. But beyond defining the boundary in this way, the book is replete with a lot of examples of the binary in the geopolitical, political, social, and other spheres. I think you give an example of how good journalism can penetrate the binary and actually produce from it, I hesitate to call it the truth, because what is truth is very difficult to find out. But I think to reveal that beyond the so-called boundary, beneath the so-called boundary, lies a lot of complexity, which we need to unravel. Now, one example I'd like to give there is your treatment of India and the nuclear suppliers group. I think those incidents happened about 10 years ago, where India was wanting to gain admission to this elite club, the nuclear suppliers group. And there were a large number of meetings of the group to consider India's application, held in Korea and a number of exotic capitals of Central Asia. The narrative painted in the Indian media was, of course, in keeping with the binary theory, that it's a standoff between the bad guys, China, and us, the good guys. The Chinese media perhaps looked at this as saying these guys are upstarts and they want to kind of join the elite club, they should be in the junior league. But as Shastri describes it, behind the scenes there were several other players, there were all kinds of vibrations and deals and concerns amongst the various other members of the group, and India and China may not even have been the key actors in the drama that really unfolded. It's just an example of how good journalism can deconstruct what really appears as a binary. The second point, and after this I'll just close with one final word. The second point I think you made is again very interesting. Right at the very end of the book, the last chapter, the last page, even the last line, you mention one reason for your optimism, and that you point to doing business. You say the Chinese want to do business, we want to do business, and you don't mention this, but I think you also mean the Americans want to do business. So I think that is a kind of commonality that drives the business segments of both countries. And therefore it was not unusual that I found in the description of binaries in your book, the business sector featured very little. There were some examples. For example, the trade deficit, India-China bilateral trade deficit is a great concern about our media, and they keep harping about it. So most businessmen in India understand why the trade deficit is happening, and in fact, if the trade deficit in certain commodities were not there, India's own exports would be very severely affected. For example, in pharma or in electronics, or indeed in the recent example of the iPhones, where we are exporting quite a big number of iPhones. The reality is that we get a lot of components from China, which we use to enable us to do these exports. So most business people understand this, and while business people are human and they would also like a nice welcoming environment to do business in China, both from the government and the media and everybody else. But if they don't have such an environment, as long as they can do business, seize opportunities, grow and make profit, they grit their teeth and get on with it. That's true for Indian businessmen, European and many others. And therefore there is a certain amount of resilience in business, which doesn't see everything as in black and white terms. In fact, they say that when the stock market is up, that's when you should sell, and when the stock market is down, that's where you should buy. So it is in some way counter-pessimistic, or whatever the word you might like to use. So I will close now with one last point, which is a question to you, Shastri, and that is, looking at a binary and looking at the optimism, suppose there was a situation where there is a severe binary, that China is the bad guy and we are the good guys, or the Americans are the good guys. But there is also an opportunity where you have to cooperate with China in order to survive. Let's say we have a situation like that. There's not an imaginary situation, because it's happening right now between the US and China. China is producing a lot of new energy, new mobility, green vehicles, green energy, and batteries and so on, which is very important for combating and getting ready to face climate change. And these things are not only advanced with technology but also quite cheap. But on the other hand, the US says, hey, these are Chinese goods. How can we get them? Our own industry will be in trouble and so on. So there is, on the one hand, binary pressure. There is, on the other hand, the existential pressure to get out of the impending doom of climate change. So how do we tackle this? So having said that, let me congratulate you once again, and I'll close my session now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We move to the next part of the book discussion. The floor is open. Any questions at a time, and I will request the panelists to respond. Yes, please. Kindly introduce yourself.
Good evening, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Shastri, for this beautiful opportunity and all the relevant personalities who have given us the ideas. As Shri Ranade had just brought out, the reality is there. China is looking at us, and I personally feel China is looking at us with its own interest in mind. Whatever China does, it keeps its interest in mind. Yes, there will be a lot of opportunities, but China knows its priority. China knows its priority with Pakistan. China knows its priority at Ladakh, making a common sector right up to China-Pakistan economic corridor. So, and China also knows the reality of that Quad, where India is joining Quad, and China is calling it a South Asian NATO or something like that. So what do you think now China must be thinking as India's reaction would be? Because of late, India has started acting in a very aggressive manner. We are not the old India where we gave 48,000 square kilometers to China and didn't speak about it. Now we have started reacting, whether it's on seven heights and Kailash or whatever the case may be. So what, by your thinking, is China's thought process about India in actual thing? Yes, what China does outside on the press and all is totally different. But China must be planning something else also to keep its interests alive. So what do you think, sir? How is China looking at India now?
We'll take it up. Let me take 2 more questions and then we'll ask them. Anybody else, please? Yes, please.
I'm V.K. Mishra from India-China Trade Center. As we have seen in past 2.5 decades during our business relations with China, we have always hoped that China will come across with some serious issues within China and we will win. So my question is with any of the panelists, you are all experts, how do we foresee next 5 years or 10 years in relation to China?
Okay.
Mr. Alphonse, please.
Yeah, Alphonse.
Just coming to you.
This is something which is not in the book, which is not discussed. Shastri, when is China going to swallow Taiwan? What time period would you give? 1 year, 2 years? It's going to happen. You are an expert.
Yes, please. The last one.
Mr. Shastri, you have written about the newspapers and the correspondence and the media. You remember that when we went there was as many as 7 Indian correspondents in Beijing at the time, and a similar kind of correspondents in India. Today we find none of them here and none of them there actually. You see. So we depend on the rhetoric of both the governments actually, so far as the relations are concerned. You see. Now how do you look at that particular thing? Because there is no communication so far as the press is concerned. And secondly, what do you and the other panelists think about encirclement of India by China?
Thank you. Let me start with Mr. Ranade, please. You can take up the question on China's thought process after the Doklam conflict.
Well, what China thinks, I think, is difficult to fathom. But we certainly get an indication of what Xi Jinping thinks, and at the moment, I think what he thinks goes. There are two things that I would point out. The first is on the opening day of the 20th Party Congress, which is the last one that was held, there was a screening of the clashes at Galwan. I think it has never been done before. This is the first time. And to my mind, it is a very clear signal that as far as Xi Jinping is concerned, this is the state of relations with India, and he does not expect any change. So I think we have to be prepared for that. The second is that while Xi Jinping has paid 3 visits to Tibet, he has been to the Western Theatre Command, etc., he has not made a direct reference to what is happening on the border. And I think that's pertinent too. The only statements that were made were by Foreign Minister, one, including on 15th June when the Galwan incident happened, when he said that Ladakh is part of China's sovereign territory, so thereby putting that matter to rest. I have personally seen no easing of tension, not come across any such indication. They keep saying that one of the reasons for the strained relationship is our getting closer to the United States. But to my mind, as I mentioned earlier, the strains had started even before we began getting so close to the United States. In fact, what they're doing now is going to push us further. So I think that for the next few years, we just have to keep our powder dry and keep ourselves ready. That's how I look at it.
The second question was with regard to how do we see China's trade progressing, economic growth in the next 5 years. The forecast right now is quite gloomy in that growth is slowing down. The efforts for massive economic globalization through the BRI continue. And in fact, 2 days back they had the China-Bangladesh BRI discussions. And that was quite new in terms of the number of projects that China wants to take up in the neighborhood. They would continue to press on renminbi internationalization. That has been an area that they have been pushing. It can be seen that the global institutions would continue to press China for a more flexible currency, more balanced currency, trade, the kind of trade surplus that they're running with many countries would need to be better balanced, and otherwise the possibility of spreading trade shocks or economic shocks across as in terms of contagion can be very high, So there is no crisis on the horizon. The banks are facing heavy debt levels, but it appears that the Chinese central bank would be in a position to overcome and come back to a more sustained growth path in the coming years. The kind of growth that they witnessed of 10% year on year from 1990 till 2010, that is that kind of growth that they witnessed under Zhou Ziaochuan as the governor of the People's Bank of China. That is not immediately visible. Growth rates have come down to 5%. It is projected to slow down even further. So it will require some kind of innovative macroeconomic policy makers to take it forward in the new years. Well, trade with India, I was part of several trade delegations as Joint Secretary Textiles, and we used to export cotton yarn and cotton. A whole number of cotton warehouses were set up, and they actually were enabling some kind of major boom in yarn production across India, with Coimbatore, Tirupur coming up as major apparel hubs. We hope that kind of trade relations continue in the coming years. third question was with regard to Mr. Alphonse on China-Taiwan relations. Would you like to take that? And also this lack of correspondence.
Communication.
Lack of correspondence. The Satrugol
Glenn has a question after.
Yes, please. We'll go for the second round once you finish.
Now on this Taiwan question, see, this is a lot of rhetoric. What will actually happen does not depend on China alone. I don't think China will swallow Taiwan anytime in the near future, any more than we, as we loudly proclaim, take POK next month or the month after. Neither of it is going to happen as one visualizes or expects or anticipates it would. This is all for public consumption. First. Second thing, if you look at it, I have one of the most contested points, observations I have made in my book. I might be off the mark because when Ravi says something, I can understand. But when Srinivas or Ranade or Mr. Shyam Saran are speaking about China, they are coming from a different place, where they have authoritative knowledge of what is going on. They have mapped it at every stage. So I am looking at perceptions, I am making inferences, I am looking at what is possible from the narratives and stories and information that I fed and I receive. I am not witness to the goings on of the deep state or the visible state or the government or actual policy making processes, which people here are. So one is that they have also been my sources of information. So I would not contest what they say, but I would bring my perception to bear in how I interpret it. So in the same way, if one looks at Taiwan, soon after Galwan, there is a paper prepared by the Chinese on when they should attain deterrence against India, when they should attain deterrence against the US in the Indo-Pacific. And since the term Indo-Pacific has come into usage, they have attained it long ago. There is a view written including by Indian experts and a lot of US strategic experts and those writing on geopolitics, that last year when there was a US plane which was intercepted by 2 Chinese fighters, they retreated, although the US was there in full force in the Taiwan Strait. So that more or less many people concluded that the US is not prepared to open a third front now. One is the front in Ukraine, the other is a front into which they are willy-nilly sucked in West Asia. And amidst all this, I personally, from what I see, the many currents of geoeconomics and geopolitics, the US hegemony is in decline. And it might be, China will be, because if you look at, China can control Taiwan in many ways. When I first went to China in 2009 and 10, there were 60 flights every day between mainland China and Taiwan. How many countries or how many broken parts like this have so many flights? Even now, if you look at the voting percentage, the one who's formed the government has got a majority of single largest. But if you add up the other two, there is a lot of people, lot of Taiwanese who are invested in businesses in mainland China. They cannot wind up their businesses. There's still a lot of economic activity going on between the two. So swallowing Taiwan will not be because China wants to just conquer Taiwan and leave it a scorched earth like the US and NATO have done to Ukraine and made Russia do it. So it's not going to happen like that. I don't believe
You
it.
just may be wrong.
Huh?
You just may be wrong.
Yeah, I may be wrong, yes. Then the second question about communication, I don't think at any point there is utter lack of communication. And I think communication is and something very strange. I will share it here. There is a press counselor at the Chinese embassy. He has not come for any of my book events. And so he confided in me he is leaving on Saturday. When this is went to India, he said, you know, you are a consulting editor for Vion TV. You know, and so you know, Vion is only interested in maligning and smearing China. So we don't want to read your book. You know? But they have to read my book to see how perception. And he is the representative of the Chinese government and this trade. And here we have Mr. Ranade saying that I have swallowed propaganda. Or at least parts of it. So I am game for this. So no, what I mean is there is communication. There may be no communication at the level of journalists. Okay, first. Second, we have some very informed journalists, very informed, really. And I think they are people of exceptional integrity and credibility who have been really brave hearts. Working in China, in Beijing, is not easy, because you are kind of buffeted between both the Indian government, which has an embassy there, and we've had diplomats there who refuse to meet the Indian press. It is astonishing. But we've had diplomats there who refuse to even meet the press to give a press release, So that is the record of so they have to keep these people happy, because if they get into trouble with the Chinese authorities, it can happen anytime. And on the other hand, they have to be truthful in what they report also. So you have people like, for instance, Anand Krishnan or Saibal Das Gupta, who have been there for so long. And there are Indian journalists there also who have worked here before, who are now working. So there is some kind of communication is always there. The second, from what I know, there is always at all times back channel communication, which may or may not be visible, but it is going on, whether it is between US and Iran or between India and China. There is never any pause, complete pause in communication. There are business delegations going from here. There are business delegations coming from there, and there are also people meeting in third countries, unacknowledged talks are taking place. And my understanding is that such talks have taken place, which paved the way before the new Chinese ambassador could assume office here. That there is some understanding that whether things get better or not, we cannot say, but that things cannot get worse, or in any case, they will not get better by not having an ambassador. So, the conclusions can be for entirely different reasons. So this is what I would. The second question you asked was about
Encirclement of India by China.
this Kalwan, this thing.
No.
Encirclement of India by China.
Encirclement of India by China. Of India by China.
How can we say? See, India was encircled before also in 1971. So this encirclement is something we think is going. Where is it? We are doing business. India is doing business with China. How can India tell Sri Lanka or Nepal or Bangladesh not to do business with China? We had given infrastructure contracts to China. How can you tell Sri Lanka not to do? And then there is a long history to the Hambantota port and everything. And I don't have the history right here, but perhaps that the project report was not prepared by China. It was by a consortium based in Amsterdam with a number of Western countries. Right? It was worked upon for a long time. And India was first offered. There was no expression of interest by India, by the government officially, nor did India encourage a section of private capital, as this government has done now, to go there and do business. So I, for one, don't subscribe to this theory of encirclement definitely by China, because China would the cost for China to encircle India would be great. It would be a burden. It is not like you had the ship in the Bay of Bengal, from the US, and all the three powers, US, UK and France, were united against India in the 1971 war. So, but that was purely a military past thinking. I think that was one of the finest hours of Indian diplomacy that did not succeed, and brought out very well in that book on P.N. Haksar by Jairam Ramesh. So I don't think there is anything to be gained by encirclement, because China will build alliances out of which India will find it difficult to stay out. You can see that now, that it is China, Russia, Iran, how it is emerging first. Second thing, the de-dollarization, the kind of slow erosion of the petrodollar. It is enough that Saudi Arabia mentions that we may trade with China in yuan. If you look at the last 2 years, the dollar reserves have come down from 71% to 58%. Everybody is preparing for de-dollarization. And I, for one, feel that the process which began with Columbus' discovery of America and then imperialism and colonialism and all that, there is a certain historical context to this. It might be idealistic, one's interpretations and readings of history might be flawed, but there is a slow shift taking place, because there are more powers on this side of the Mediterranean than on that side. You look at the state of Europe, it is being led by the war in Ukraine. And So I don't think this China doesn't need to encircle. And to his question also, China is not thinking of India every day. We don't figure loom so large in China as China looms here. This is a point I've made in my book repeatedly. And you go talk to them, many of them don't know so little about India. The only country the Chinese look at it all the time is United States, America. What America is doing, how America is doing. And in my book also I am making the same point. All the developing countries, their governments are so busy doing what the American government wants them to do that they are not sitting back and in a detached manner studying what America itself is doing. We should look at very closely how the US deals with China. Every year there is, I just say this one point and then, is you have this lot of noise made of the Shangri-La dialogue because it's all about defense. But soon after the Shangri-La dialogue, where the Pacific commander of the US Navy will say something and then then there is a 3-day security and economic dialogue that goes on in Beijing. I do not remember a single year when any Indian newspaper or magazine produced an exhaustive paper on what goes on at this dialogue. What are the gains made? What are the losses scored by each? Why are we not looking at it? Why don't we study this? Second, China and Japan. They might be rhetorically hostile to each other, but there are so many forums. There is the Tokyo Forum, Beijing Forum, the Bao Forum, where they meet regularly. So there is a lot of things going on. The world is not arrayed against China. And it doesn't need to. I think it will not want the liability of encircling India or any other country.
Yes, we'll take a second round of 3 questions. We are already 15 minutes behind schedule. Yes, sir, please. You could use the mic, sir.
Yes. I just want to make 2 very brief
Mic
comments.
is not on.
Oh,
Yes,
sorry.
process.
For those who don't know me already, and I know most of the people there, I'm Prem Shankar Jha, and I have written extensively on China, including 2 books that came out in 2009 and 2010. I have 2 very brief comments only. One is the question, will China swallow Taiwan? The answer is never, not no, but never. For a very simple reason, which people don't think about most of the time. Taiwan produces 80% of all the silicon chips in the world and is way ahead, as you know, in terms of its technological development also. China is their biggest buyer, so big that it is the only Taiwan is the only country, and I call it a country, in the world with which China has a trade deficit of 2 years ago, $3.8 billion. They have gone up by quite a lot by now because the Chinese exports have also been suffering. Okay, point 1. Point 2, how will China cope with the recession? Well, the recession began in 2015-16 because of colossal over expenditure, uncontrollable over expenditure of the kind of fiscal stimulus program that had begun in 2009. Against 4.3 trillion yuan, which were the original intention. The Chinese have very little control over their 31 provinces. And this is a subject of an entire book I wrote. But you know, I'm not going to touch on that. But the thing is that how will China cope with recession? What happened was, when it went out of control, instead of 4.3 trillion by 2015-16, this investment stimulus had gone to 24.5 trillion yuan. And China was flooded with capacity in every heavy industry that it could not use. Plenty of it have been written about that. I'm sure many of you are aware of this. The BRI was an attempt to keep those industries and those millions of people still working. You know, and the biggest place was they wanted it for India. They are very, very keen to come to India. If you remember, Xi Jinping, before he came to meet Modi, the day before, something unprecedented happened. The Chinese Foreign Office announced in advance that he is going to come to India to invest $500 billion in India over the next 6 years. And what is unusual is that the same statement was made in an official press conference by the China's representative in Bombay, what do you call it, Consul General, and at a press conference. Now all that was blown apart when we refused the word BRI, not because there was anything that was to be gained from it, not even because of any enmity that China had been showing towards us. In fact, the whole of the previous 6 years had been the exact opposite. Dr. Shankar Menon sometime he will tell you. But anyway, the thing is that when we completely refused to go into BRI, we cut our own throats. And I'll just stop there because there's one or two other points, but
Yes, please. Yes, please. We'll come back to you, ma'am. I'll just take your question. Yes, please.
So my name is Adil Chopra. I just want to know that the Chinese have studied this in great detail. Under what conditions could the Chinese Communist Party collapse as happened in the Soviet Union, where the Soviets collapsed? Is there a possibility that could happen? And what are the signals that we would get? Should this be coming up in the future? Because I'm told, when I went to China, I'm told there's a great resentment amongst the people of China against the party. The party seems to be having a good time. All the emperors are, well placed ever. But the common people are quite upset. And so, is there any signals that we could get, or we should read, that the Communist Party is going to collapse?
Yes, please. Yes, ma'am.
Can you get the mic, please? So, it's not the question, like, it's kind of comment. So what I'm saying, people here are really obsessed. I mean, they are too obsessed, thinking that China must be thinking about us. I don't think China is having any time for us. I mean, they even do not acknowledge us, let alone think or something like that. What they challenge very openly to US. We go to US to ask for help and all the things. We form collaborations and the squad and all the things, while China is with Russia and doing independently everything. So can we stop being in dreams, please? And the second thing is about Tibet, swallowing Tibet. I mean, you gentlemen have mentioned that they have great deficit with Taiwan. So Taiwanese businessmen never want to leave China. And it's like swallowing Taiwan, and Taiwan is being being like a colony of China. It's all Western media propaganda. We should be like, we must be going for facts rather than these vested interest of media, the industrialists who are owning these media companies. We should be going for the facts mainly, not these what media is feeding us. So I better would say this. Thank you, and thank you for this enlightening conversation.
So I'll be very brief. But before I ask two questions, Masti, I've made 8 trips to China, and I spent 9 days with Shastri in Kerala in the same room. We were invited as journalists. I was supposed to write on how good the labor has been in Kerala, and Shastri was asked. So they were very wonderful days. And by the way, he's written a book on what happened in India. So I said to myself, why the hell should I buy Shastri's book? He must present me his book, and he will, I'm sure. But today I bought your book. On a second note, please note the first chapter. I've never taken a fast train from the Beijing airport, the Shanghai airport to town. Very expensive. China is not cheap. Certainly the bus is cheap, the train is cheap. For the common man, everything is cheap. But for anybody else with luxury, it's America. You got to pay for the iPhone. You got to pay. So again, this is personal. On the third trip, I asked my wife, why don't you join me? I went for conferences, I'm a Navy man. So I reached
sorry, Beijing, or Pudong. Where is Pudong? Shanghai or Beijing? I'm old, I'm 86.
Shanghai.
Shanghai. So I reached Shanghai and I looked at my wife. She's from Kerala, like Shastri, so we sometimes speak Malayalam, what is Kannada. But I said to her, look at Pudong. You've been to New York with me. You've been to London with me. Can you see this? Aren't you impressed? And you know what she said in 2016? No, I'm not impressed. She's very clever. She's from LSR and all. I didn't know what it. You know what she said? I'm not impressed. I said, what the hell is wrong with you? You're not impressed with China? He said, no, I'm not impressed. Why can't we do it in India? That was my first explanation to China. I mean, you have to go there. I read your first chapter. I paid for the book. So, you are very clear. I'm very happy you did that. That's 2009. I've been in 2018. We still have that impression that little girl is telling us about. That China. You go there, you're free. You're absolute. Yes, you can't speak against the government, you can't speak against me. So I want to say this in my personal. On economics, sir, do you know what 4% growth in China means on 18 crores? Yes. And what?
18 trillion.
18 trillion. How much it means?
Yes,
a bachcha, 7-year-old will tell you. India can grow with 4 trillion at 8%. You can't keep up with China. On Taiwan, if China takes over Taiwan, somebody there has said the economy of Taiwan, my God, that economy will be crazy. America will have to wake up. So, this is my personal view. But 2 questions to you, Shastri. During my stay with you and learning how to do journalism, you're fantastic. You corrected part of my books. So did, by the way. Do you think we can do without China? First question. Do you think we are in Asia? We are neighbors. I mean, how can you not live with your neighbor? First question. A very simple question. I'm not a complicated Vidwan. The second question is to you, Abudari. I want to thank you very, very, very much. Mr. Shansar has left. Somebody told me you have written about the book about energy. I came to Mr. Shansar. I said, sir, I went to China and they told me very, very clearly, America begged us, let us do the nuclear deal. And we told America, we will allow one allowance to India. On one condition, America will never raise this issue when we give Kanuk 2 and 3 projects of Pakistan. Mr. Shaw said, no, we did nothing. You said the words. The action was between other countries. Nothing to do with India. And finally, you've written in your book, and I admire you, Pakistan thanked China. That it did. So there is the truth. They have got power. Even to NSC, you said it yourself. Your book says it. They're a powerful country. Last question is between you people. I know you're going to say you're not a military man and all that, but 1 week I taught you something. Right. The border with 1959, I don't know much, but I know Navy and what is border. 1959, you were told by China, this is the border. At that time, we said, no, we'll do this. 62, they came and showed you the border. I mean, I'm talking as an analyst, I'm not talking as an Indian or a Chinese or how American. They showed you 62 border. Now, sir, we've come down to that 59 thereabouts. And you've got no man's land like in Korea. You can't cross. Indian soldier crosses that no man's land, he'll be shot. A Chinese soldier crosses that no man's land in Ladakh, he'll be shot. They admit in the east you've got everything. This Arunachal Pradesh and all is bits. So 2 questions to you and 1 was there. Can we live without China?
Can we live without China? Without. Okay. Yeah, I'm finished. Okay, I'll be very brief. It'll answer more than one question. And I have to go back to a question which Commodore Ranjit Rai, which Ravi had asked. I think you have amplified the same question as to this binary when India has to take sides between the US and China, for example? Would there come a time, or how will we decide? You know? And your question, now to answer that, I don't think any country makes such hard and fast exclusive choices. No. We saw during the Iran-Iraq war,